Howdy, partners, and welcome to tonight's tale from the untamed frontiers of the American West. As the evening sun sets over distant mountains, we invite you to lay down your weary head and drift into the mysterious world of Red Dead Redemption. Each night, we'll share different tales from these wild lands, where outlaws and legends still roam free. And when our story ends, the gentle sounds of the frontier, crackling campfires, distant coyotes, rustling prairie grass, and the soft whisper of the wind will carry you into peaceful dreams beneath the star-filled western sky, with no advertisements to disturb your slumber. Now, saddle up, partner, and let's mosey on down to tonight's tale. The first drops of rain struck Elena Vasquez's weathered hat as she guided her horse along the narrow ridge overlooking Serpent's Back Arroyo. At 24, Elena possessed the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to read the land's moods through necessity rather than choice. Her father's death 3 winters prior had left her with a struggling ranch, a handful of cattle, and questions about her future that seemed to multiply like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The arroyo stretched below her like a scar carved deep into the high desert, its serpentine path twisting through layers of red and gold sandstone that told stories of ancient floods and patient erosion. During spring runoff or sudden summer storms, the narrow canyon became a rushing torrent that could sweep away anything caught in its path. But for most of the year, it remained bone dry, its smooth floor marked only by scattered debris and the occasional animal track pressed into hardened mud from the last significant rain. Thunder rumbled somewhere beyond the western mountains, still distant but carrying the promise of serious weather moving across the territory. Eleanor had been checking fence lines on the far boundary of her property when the sky began its ominous transformation from clear blue to the peculiar greenish-gray that experienced desert dwellers recognized as harbinger of potentially dangerous storms. Her horse, a reliable mare named Esperanza, shifted nervously beneath her, ears flicking toward the approaching thunder while nostrils flared to test the changing air. Elena reached forward to stroke the animal's neck reassuringly, though she felt her own growing unease as lightning flickered through the distant clouds, still too far away for accompanying thunder, but close enough to illuminate the storm's impressive scope. "Easy, girl," she murmured, her voice steady despite internal uncertainty about their best course of action. "We'll find shelter before it reaches us." The words carried more hope than conviction. Her planned route home would require at least 2 hours of careful riding across exposed terrain, with limited options for substantial shelter should the storm arrive ahead of schedule. The arroyo itself offered some protection from wind, but its narrow confines could become deadly trap if flash flooding occurred. Eleanor had learned caution regarding desert storms from her father, who had survived these lands for nearly 4 decades by respecting rather than challenging their occasional fury. "The desert forgives many mistakes," he had often told her, "but never the mistake of underestimating water's power when it finally comes." As if summoned by her thoughts of him, Elena reached into her saddlebag and withdrew the leather-bound journal she had discovered among his possessions after the funeral. She had been carrying it with her for months now, finding comfort in his careful observations about weather, cattle, land management. The journal's pages chronicled not only practical ranching knowledge, but also his hopes for her future and his quiet pride in her growing competence, managing responsibilities that would have overwhelmed many people her age. Opening to a page marked with a pressed wildflower, Elena read words written in her father's careful script. "Elena shows remarkable instinct for reading both cattle and weather. More importantly, she's learning to trust her intuition even when logic suggests different courses. This balance between reason and instinct will serve her well in decisions far beyond ranching. The entry was dated just 6 months before his death, during a period when she had been struggling with doubts about her ability to maintain the ranch alone. His confidence in her capabilities provided an ongoing source of strength during moments when the future seemed overwhelming or uncertain. Another rumble of thunder, closer now, reminded Elena of her current predicament. She closed the journal carefully and returned it to the saddlebag, then studied the landscape ahead with renewed attention to potential shelter options. A cluster of large boulders about a mile northeast might offer adequate protection, though reaching them would require crossing several exposed areas where lightning could pose significant danger. As she considered alternatives, movement in the arroyo below caught her attention. At first, she thought it might be an animal seeking shelter, but the steady, purposeful nature of the motion suggested something different. Focusing more carefully, Elena detected what appeared to be a faint light moving slowly along the arroyo's floor, barely visible in the growing gloom of the approaching storm. The light seemed to flicker occasionally, as if buffeted by wind, yet maintained consistent progress westward through the narrow canyon. Its pale, yellowish glow resembled a lantern's illumination, though Elena couldn't imagine why anyone would be traveling through the arroyo during approaching storm conditions, particularly carrying such exposed illumination. Esperanza whinnied softly, drawing Eleanor's attention back to her immediate surroundings. The wind had increased noticeably, carrying the distinctive scent of rain and ozone that preceded significant weather events. Lightning flickered more frequently now, followed by thunder that suggested the storm's leading edge would reach their position within perhaps 30 minutes. Yet Elena found herself oddly reluctant to abandon observation of the mysterious light moving through the arroyo below. Something about its steady, unhurried progress suggested familiarity with the terrain that transcended ordinary human knowledge of the area. Rather than seeming lost or urgent, the light moved with quiet confidence, as if following paths known intimately, despite the approaching danger. Who would be down there now, she wondered aloud, her voice barely audible above the increasing wind. The question triggered memory of conversations with Doña Carmen, the elderly woman who managed the general store in nearby Esperanza Springs and served as unofficial keeper of local history and folklore. Every spring, when tourists and new settlers asked about the area's stories, Doña Carmen would recount various tales of the high desert's mysterious aspects, always delivered with the perfect balance of skepticism and respect that characterized truly wise storytellers. One story in particular now emerged from Elena's memory with startling clarity: the tale of Jeremiah Whitmore, a homesteader who had established a small farm at the mouth of Serpent's Back Arroyo in the early 1870s. Whitmore had been known throughout the territory for his generosity toward travelers and his uncanny ability to predict weather patterns, often providing shelter and guidance to those caught unprepared by the desert's sudden mood changes. According to Doña Carmen's version of the story, Whitmore had disappeared during a particularly severe spring flood, last seen carrying a lantern while attempting to reach help for his sick wife. His body was never recovered, though searchers had found his hat caught in debris miles downstream, several days after the flood receded. His wife had died during his absence, leaving behind only questions about his fate and grateful memories from countless travelers who had benefited from his assistance. But every few years, Doña Carmen would conclude her telling, her voice dropping to thoughtful whisper, especially during storms, people claim to see a lantern moving through the arroyo where Jeremiah's farm used to be. Some say it's his spirit, still trying to complete that last journey for help. Others believe it's something more practical, his way of guiding lost travelers to safety, continuing in death the hospitality he showed in life. Elena had always appreciated these stories as colorful local folklore rather than literal truth. Yet watching the mysterious light below, she found herself reconsidering the distinction between legend and reality. The illumination continued its steady progress through terrain that would challenge experienced travelers even in daylight, moving with purpose that suggested intimate knowledge of safe passages through the arroyo's complex geography. Lightning flashed more intensely, briefly illuminating the entire landscape with stark clarity that revealed no visible bearer of the lantern, only the light itself, hovering perhaps 4 feet above the arroyo's floor, continuing its measured westward journey despite wind that should have extinguished any ordinary flame. Thunder followed almost immediately, indicating the storm had closed much of the distance between its original position and Elena's current location. She needed to make immediate decision about shelter, yet found herself increasingly drawn to the possibility that the mysterious light might represent guidance rather than mere curiosity. Doña Carmen's final words about the lantern story returned to her thoughts with unexpected relevance. Sometimes the light's not lost, it's looking for someone ready to follow. But following requires more than curiosity. It demands trust in mysteries that logic can't explain. Elena studied the terrain between her position and the arroyo floor, calculating the risks involved in descending to investigate more closely. The slope appeared manageable for Esperanza, though returning to high ground quickly would be difficult if flash flooding occurred. Yet something about the lantern's steady progress suggested knowledge of conditions that might not be apparent from her elevated vantage point. What would Papa advise? She asked herself, remembering his emphasis on balancing reason with intuition when facing uncertain decisions. The answer seemed to emerge from the journal's remembered pages. Trust the instincts that had been developing through years of careful observation, while maintaining respect for dangers that demanded practical caution. The mysterious light might indeed represent guidance, but following it required preparation for multiple contingencies. Elena dismounted, checking Esperanza's tack and ensuring her saddlebags were secure for potentially challenging terrain. She retrieved a coiled rope from behind her saddle, fastening it within easy reach, and verified that her matches remained dry in their waterproof container. If the lantern led to shelter, she wanted to be prepared to take advantage of the opportunity. If it led to danger, she needed resources for managing whatever challenges might arise. Remounting, Elena guided Esperanza toward a section of the ridge where game trails provided relatively safe descent into the arroyo. The wind had intensified further, carrying the first scattered raindrops of what promised to become significant precipitation within minutes. Lightning flickered continuously now, accompanied by rolling thunder that seemed to emanate from multiple directions as the storm's sound echoed off canyon walls and distant mesas. As they descended toward the arroyo floor, Elena maintained visual contact with the mysterious light, which continued its unhurried westward progress approximately half a mile ahead of their position. The illumination appeared unchanged by their approach, neither brightening with proximity nor dimming with apparent awareness of human presence. Instead, it maintained consistent intensity and pace, as if operating according to purpose that transcended ordinary concerns about observers or followers. Reaching the arroyo's floor, Elena immediately noticed the dramatic change in acoustic environment. Wind sounds became muffled by surrounding stone walls, while the approaching storm's audio effects seemed amplified and concentrated by the narrow canyon's natural amplification properties. Thunder reverberated with deep, sustained resonance that suggested the power contained within the weather system now approaching their position. The arroyo itself proved wider than it had appeared from above, with floor space sufficient for comfortable riding despite scattered boulders and occasional debris from previous floods. The walls rose 20 to 30 feet on either side, carved into smooth flowing curves by countless years of water action that had created formations of remarkable beauty, despite their origin in violent forces. Elena urged Esperanza forward, maintaining steady pace that gradually closed distance between them and the mysterious light ahead. As they traveled, she noticed details that hadn't been visible from the ridge. The lantern, for it did indeed appear to be some form of lantern rather than natural phenomenon, cast illumination that seemed to reveal optimal path through obstacles that might otherwise require careful navigation in increasing darkness. Boulders that could have blocked passage were revealed to have narrow gaps suitable for horse and rider. Sections where debris might have created hazardous footing showed clearly defined safe routes that avoided potential problems. The light's placement consistently illuminated solutions rather than merely highlighting obstacles, as if its bearer possessed intimate knowledge of the arroyo's geography and potential challenges for travelers. Rain began falling more steadily, though the canyon walls provided some protection from wind-driven precipitation. Eleanor pulled her hat lower and adjusted her jacket, grateful for the partial shelter, while remaining alert to signs of water accumulation that might indicate flash flooding potential. So far, the arroyo floor remained firm beneath Esperanza's hooves, with only shallow puddles forming in natural depressions carved into the sandstone. Lightning illuminated the canyon with increasing frequency, creating dramatic interplay of light and shadow that transformed familiar geological features into mysterious landscapes that seemed to shift and change with each flash. During these moments of intense illumination, Elena searched for a glimpse of the lantern's bearer, yet saw only the light itself, suspended at consistent height above the canyon floor, as if carried by invisible hands. The mystery deepened her fascination, while challenging assumptions about the nature of what she followed. If no visible person carried the lantern, what explained its purposeful movement and apparently intelligent navigation of terrain obstacles? Was she witnessing genuine supernatural phenomenon? Or did practical explanation exist beyond her current understanding? Thunder crashed overhead with intensity that made Esperanza sidestep nervously, though the mare quickly settled when Elena's steady hands on the reins conveyed confidence despite her own growing apprehension about the storm's power. The sound reverberated through the canyon with almost physical force, emphasizing their isolation within landscape that could become dangerous with little warning. Yet the mysterious light continued its steady progress, seemingly unaffected by weather conditions that would challenge any ordinary traveler. Its glow remained constant despite wind and rain that should have extinguished normal flames, while its pace never varied regardless of terrain difficulties that would naturally slow human movement through the increasingly treacherous conditions. As they rounded a bend in the arroyo, Eleanor glimpsed something ahead that made her catch her breath in surprise. The canyon walls opened into a wider area where ancient flood action had carved a natural amphitheater surrounded by towering stone formations. Within this sheltered space, partially concealed by overhang that would provide excellent protection from rain, stood the remnants of what had clearly once been human habitation. Stone foundations outlined the basic structure of a modest dwelling, while scattered debris suggested the presence of other buildings that had been destroyed by flood action sometime in the past. A few weathered wooden posts remained upright, marking what might have been corrals or garden areas, though most evidence of human occupation had been erased by years of weather and occasional flash floods. The mysterious lantern had paused at the edge of this area, its light now casting gentle illumination across the ruins in manner that seemed almost reverent, as if acknowledging memories contained within stones that had once provided foundation for human dreams and daily life. Eleanor realized she was likely looking at what remained of Jeremiah Whitmore's homestead, the farm mentioned in Doña Carmen's story about the helpful settler who had disappeared during his final attempt to seek medical assistance. Rain increased to steady downpour as Elena guided Esperanza toward the overhang that promised shelter from the storm's intensifying fury. Lightning crashed continuously now, followed by thunder so close that the time between flash and sound had nearly disappeared, indicating the storm's center was directly overhead. As they approached the ruins, the mysterious lantern began moving again, this time leading toward a section of the rock overhang where Elena could see evidence of more recent use. Fire-blackened stones arranged in careful circle, stack of dried wood protected from weather by natural rock shelter, and what appeared to be rough furniture constructed from materials salvaged from the original homestead. The light paused beside this prepared camping area, then began a slow circuit around the sheltered space, as if ensuring Eleanor noticed all available resources and advantages of the location. During this process, its illumination revealed additional details that confirmed someone had prepared this site specifically for providing emergency shelter to travelers caught by severe weather. A cache of supplies, carefully protected from moisture, contained basic necessities: dried food, medical supplies, extra blankets, and tools that might prove essential during extended stay. Everything appeared recently maintained, though Elena saw no evidence of current occupancy or recent human presence beyond the preparatory work itself. The lantern completed its circuit and moved to position near the entrance to the sheltered area, where its light continued steady illumination that welcomed Elena while seeming to stand guard against the storm's fury. Rain pounded the desert beyond their shelter with intensity that would have made continued travel not only uncomfortable but genuinely dangerous, while lightning and thunder created constant display of nature's overwhelming power. Elena dismounted and led Esperanza under the protective overhang, grateful for shelter that appeared perfectly suited to their current needs. As she removed the mare's saddle and began rubbing down her coat with a handful of dry grass found among the cached supplies, she reflected on the remarkable chain of circumstances that had led her to safety just as the storm reached its peak intensity. "Thank you," she said softly, addressing words toward the mysterious lantern, though uncertain whether its light represented supernatural presence or merely fortunate coincidence that had guided her to pre-existing shelter. The light flickered once, as if acknowledging her gratitude, then settled into steady glow that provided comfortable illumination for arranging their temporary camp. Eleanor built fire in the prepared stone circle, using dry wood from the provided stack, and soon had warmth and additional light to supplement the lantern's mysterious radiance. As she settled beside the fire with a cup of coffee brewed from supplies in her own pack, Eleanor withdrew her father's journal and opened it to random page, seeking his words for comfort during her first night away from the ranch since his death. Her eyes fell upon entry written during a particularly difficult period, when drought had threatened their cattle and financial survival seemed uncertain. Sometimes the path forward becomes visible only when we stop trying to control every aspect of our journey, her father had written. The desert teaches patience and acceptance of forces beyond human influence, while reward comes to those who remain alert to opportunities that present themselves through circumstances we never could have planned or anticipated. Lightning continued its brilliant display beyond their shelter, while thunder provided dramatic soundtrack to her contemplation of the day's extraordinary events. The mysterious lantern maintained its steady glow from its position near the cave entrance, creating an atmosphere of peaceful watchfulness that seemed to invite reflection rather than mere rest. Elena found herself considering not only the practical benefits of the shelter they had found, but also the deeper implications of trusting intuition over conventional logic when facing uncertainty. Following the mysterious light had led to safety and comfort, yet it had also challenged her assumptions about the nature of guidance and the sources from which help might come during times of need. The storm raged for several hours, with rain falling in torrents that would have made any travel impossible even without the lightning danger. Yet within their protected space, Eleanor felt a sense of peace and security that transcended mere physical comfort. Something about the lantern's presence suggested protective watch being maintained by a benevolent force that asked nothing in return for the guidance and shelter it provided. As the storm gradually diminished and lightning became less frequent, Eleanor noticed the mysterious light beginning to fade, not through extinction, but through gentle transition that suggested its purpose for the evening had been fulfilled. By the time rain stopped completely and stars began appearing through breaks in dispersing clouds, the lantern had vanished entirely, leaving only memory of its guidance and the practical benefits of the shelter it had revealed. Morning arrived with the crystalline clarity characteristic of desert air washed clean by significant rainfall. Elena woke naturally as dawn light began filtering into their shelter, immediately checking on Esperanza before surveying their surroundings in daylight. The ruins of Whitmore's homestead appeared more extensive than she had realized the previous evening, with foundation outlines revealing what had once been substantial farming operation adapted to high desert conditions. Most remarkable, however, were signs that the shelter they had used was maintained regularly by someone who obviously cared about providing assistance to travelers caught by weather emergencies. The supplies were too well organized and recently stocked to have been left by casual visitors, while the arrangement of furniture and fire circle showed thoughtful attention to creating maximum comfort within natural limitations of the cave environment. Elena spent additional time exploring the area, searching for clues about who maintained this refuge and whether they might be connected to the mysterious lantern that had guided her to safety. She found no definitive answers, though scattered evidence suggested regular but infrequent visits by someone who preferred anonymity to acknowledgement for their charitable efforts. Near the entrance to the shelter, carved discreetly into stone where it would be noticed by those who looked carefully but missed by casual observers, Elena discovered an inscription that made her smile with recognition. For those who follow the light with trust rather than fear, JW. The initials could easily represent Jeremiah Whitmore, though Elena realized she might never know whether the inscription was original to the historical homesteader or added later by someone who chose to honor his memory by continuing traditions of hospitality he had established during his lifetime. Either way, the message captured perfectly the spirit of guidance and protection she had experienced during the previous evening's extraordinary events. As she prepared for the journey home, Elena reflected on changes the experience had created in her perspective regarding both practical navigation and deeper questions about direction in life. Following the mysterious light had required trusting instincts over conventional caution, yet this trust had led to safety, comfort, and expanded understanding of possibilities she had never previously considered. The parallel between literal navigation and life direction seemed obvious, yet profound. Just as the lantern had illuminated safe passage through potentially dangerous terrain, perhaps other forms of guidance were available to those willing to perceive and follow them, even when logical analysis couldn't fully explain their nature or origin. Elena mounted Esperanza and began their journey home through landscape transformed by the previous night's rain. Desert plants showed fresh color and vitality, while small streams ran briefly in normally dry washes, creating temporary beauty that would soon disappear, but provided immediate joy to eyes accustomed to more arid conditions. As they climbed out of the arroyo and onto familiar terrain leading toward her ranch, Elena turned for final look at the sheltered area where they had found protection. In morning sunlight, it appeared as simply another geological formation marked by historical ruins, remarkable in its own right, but containing no obvious hints of the mysterious guidance they had experienced during the storm. Yet Elena knew she would remember the lantern's steady light and protective presence for the rest of her life, not merely as curious incident, but as demonstration that help and direction might come from sources beyond conventional understanding, available to those who remained alert to possibilities that transcended ordinary perception. Arriving home several hours later, Elena found her cattle safe and her property undamaged, despite the storm's intensity. As she settled Esperanza in the corral and began routine tasks of ranch maintenance, she carried with her renewed confidence that even when future challenges arose, guidance would be available to those who maintained openness to mystery, while coupling such receptivity with practical wisdom and appropriate caution. That evening, as she updated her father's journal with account of her experience, Elena concluded her entry with words that captured the transformation she felt. Sometimes the path forward illuminates itself through means we cannot fully explain, requiring trust in forms of guidance that logic alone cannot validate. Yet when we follow such light with respect and courage, we often discover that we were never truly lost, merely learning to see possibilities that had been present all along, waiting for eyes willing to perceive them. The mysterious lantern of Serpent's Back Arroyo had provided more than shelter from a storm. It had offered lesson in recognizing and following the various forms of guidance that surround us, often invisible until circumstances create readiness to receive their illumination. Eleanor closed the journal with quiet gratitude for an experience that had deepened her understanding of both the high desert she called home and the mysterious forces that sometimes emerge to assist those who journey through it with open hearts and trusting spirits. Outside her window, stars appeared with exceptional brilliance in air cleared by the storm, each point of light a reminder that illumination comes in many forms to those who learn to perceive it. The desert night held its secrets close, yet Elena now knew that some of those secrets were meant to be discovered by travelers willing to follow mysterious lights toward shelter, safety, and expanded understanding of the remarkable world that surrounded them. In the days that followed her encounter with the mysterious lantern, Elena found herself observing her surroundings with heightened awareness that seemed to reveal details previously overlooked despite years of familiarity with the high desert landscape. Colors appeared more vivid during sunrise and sunset. Shadows carried subtle variations she had never noticed, and the songs of birds contained nuances that suggested communications she was only beginning to understand. Her cattle seemed to sense this change in her attention, responding with increased cooperation during daily routines that had sometimes required significant effort to accomplish. When she moved among them, checking their condition and guiding them toward better grazing areas, they followed her directions with willingness that suggested recognition of her enhanced connection to the rhythms and requirements of their shared environment. The ranch itself appeared to reflect this improved harmony between human intention and natural processes. Tasks that had previously demanded exhausting physical labor seemed to flow more easily, as if her increased attuneness to subtle environmental cues helped her work with, rather than against, the desert's inherent patterns. Fence repairs that might have taken an entire day were completed by mid-afternoon, leaving time for exploration and observation that deepened her understanding of the land she was responsible for managing. Most significantly, Elena discovered that her father's journal contained layers of meaning she had missed during previous readings. His observations about weather patterns, animal behavior, and seasonal changes revealed connections between seemingly unrelated phenomena that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the high desert's complex ecological relationships. References she had initially considered merely practical guidance now appeared as invitations to develop the same intuitive awareness that had made her father a successful rancher, despite challenging conditions that defeated many others. The desert rewards those who learn to listen, read one entry that now carried particular resonance. Not merely to obvious sounds like wind and thunder, but to subtle communications that emerge through careful attention to relationships between earth, sky, plants, animals, and weather. These relationships form patterns that repeat across different scales, from daily cycles to seasonal changes to longer rhythms that span multiple years. Understanding these patterns provides foundation for decisions that work with natural forces rather than opposing them. Eleanor began implementing this philosophy through systematic observation of her property during different times of day and varying weather conditions. She discovered that certain areas showed optimal conditions for cattle grazing at specific times, while other locations served better as shelter during storms or extreme temperatures. Water sources revealed seasonal variations in flow and quality that could be predicted through attention to rainfall patterns, snow accumulation in distant mountains, and subtle changes in vegetation that indicated underground moisture levels. 3 weeks after her encounter with the lantern, Elena received unexpected visit from Doña Carmen, who arrived at the ranch during late afternoon while Elena was working in her small garden plot behind the main house. The elderly woman approached on foot, having left her horse tethered near the front gate, and carried herself with dignity that commanded immediate respect despite her obviously advanced age. "Buenos tardes, Elena," Doña Carmen greeted her, accepting offered chair on the small porch where they could sit comfortably while enjoying view of the surrounding landscape. "I hope you don't mind my unannounced visit, but I felt compelled to speak with you about something that has been occupying my thoughts." Elena poured fresh water from the well into 2 cups, settling into adjacent chair, while curious about what might have prompted this visit from someone she knew primarily through occasional encounters at Esperanza Springs General Store. Doña Carmen's reputation for wisdom and insight made her opinions valued throughout the community, though she rarely offered unsolicited advice unless circumstances suggested genuine need for her perspective. "Several people have mentioned seeing you recently," the older woman continued, accepting the water gratefully. "Elena commented that you seem different somehow, more confident, more settled in your connection to this place. Since your father's death, many of us worried about whether you would find your footing here or eventually decide to leave for easier circumstances elsewhere." Elena considered this observation thoughtfully, recognizing its accuracy while wondering what had made the change sufficiently obvious for others to notice and comment upon. "I've been spending more time really observing the land," she admitted, "learning to see patterns I think Papa understood but never explained directly." Doña Carmen nodded with expression that suggested this response confirmed something she had suspected. "Your father was one of those rare people who develop genuine partnership with the desert rather than merely trying to impose his will upon it. This required patience, humility, and willingness to accept guidance from sources that more practical-minded individuals often dismiss as imagination or coincidence." The conversation's direction reminded Elena immediately of her experience with the mysterious lantern, though she hesitated to mention such personal encounter without clearer indication that Doña Carmen would receive the account with appropriate understanding rather than skeptical dismissal. "I've been wondering," Elena said carefully, "about some of the stories you tell regarding unusual phenomena in this region." How much do you believe represents literal truth versus symbolic teaching? The older woman smiled with expression that suggested she had been expecting exactly this type of question. Truth comes in many forms, Mia. Sometimes the most important truths can only be communicated through stories that conventional logic would reject as impossible, yet which carry meaning that transforms those who receive them with open hearts. She paused, studying Eleanor's face with eyes that seemed to see beyond surface appearances into deeper considerations that might be influencing her curiosity. But perhaps you have reason for asking that goes beyond academic interest in folklore. Eleanor found herself describing her encounter with the lantern in the arroyo, beginning with her initial concern about the approaching storm and concluding with her discovery of the maintained shelter and the inscription that suggested continuing care for travelers who might need assistance. Throughout her telling, Doña Carmen listened with complete attention, occasionally nodding but never interrupting or expressing skepticism about details that might seem incredible to more conventional listeners. When Eleanor finished her account, Doña Carmen remained silent for several minutes, gazing toward the western horizon where Serpent's Back Arroyo carved its invisible path through landscape that appeared ordinary but clearly contained dimensions beyond immediate perception. Finally, she spoke, with voice that carried weight of years spent observing mysteries that defied simple explanation. "You were chosen," she said simply. "Not everyone who encounters storms in that area sees the lantern, even those who might desperately need its guidance. Its appearance requires readiness to perceive and follow direction that comes through means conventional wisdom would reject." This confirmation of the experience's significance provided Alina with validation she hadn't realized she needed, along with deeper questions about the implications of having been selected for such guidance. But why me? And what does it mean for my future here? Doña Carmen rose from her chair, moving to the porch railing where she could observe the landscape while considering her response. "Your father once told me that the greatest challenge facing this territory was maintaining connection between human activity and natural wisdom, as development brought changes that could easily destroy relationships that had taken generations to establish. He believed certain individuals would emerge who could serve as bridges between old understanding and new circumstances." She turned to face Elena directly, expression serious yet encouraging. "Perhaps the lantern appeared because you are becoming one of those bridge people, someone who can help preserve essential knowledge while adapting it to changing conditions. Such individuals require both practical skills and openness to guidance that comes through unconventional channels." The conversation continued as evening approached, with Doña Carmen sharing additional stories about individuals throughout the region's history who had experienced encounters with phenomena that provided crucial guidance during significant transitions. These accounts suggested a pattern of mysterious assistance available to those who faced important responsibilities with insufficient conventional resources, yet demonstrated willingness to trust forms of help that couldn't be fully explained or controlled. As darkness claimed the landscape and Doña Carmen prepared to return to town, she offered final observation that would influence Eleanor's thinking for months to come. "The lantern appeared when you needed guidance for both immediate danger and longer-term direction. Now that you've accepted such guidance once, you may find other forms of assistance becoming available as your responsibilities continue to grow. The key is maintaining balance between practical preparation and openness to help that arrives through unexpected means." Over the following months, Elena discovered the accuracy of this prediction through series of seemingly coincidental events that consistently provided solutions to challenges that might otherwise have proven overwhelming. When drought threatened her cattle's water supply, exploration of her property revealed previously unknown spring that had been concealed by seasonal vegetation. When equipment breakdowns threatened to derail essential ranch maintenance, traveling merchants arrived with needed parts they claimed to have acquired by fortunate accident, rather than specific planning. Most significantly, Elena began receiving visits from neighboring ranchers who sought her advice regarding land management decisions that required balancing immediate practical needs with longer-term environmental sustainability. Her reputation for possessing unusual insight into desert ecology spread gradually throughout the region, leading to consultations that supplemented her ranch income, while establishing her as respected voice in community discussions about development and conservation. During these interactions, Elena often found herself sharing perspectives that seemed to emerge from understanding deeper than her conscious knowledge should have encompassed. Solutions to complex problems would present themselves during conversations, as if her encounter with the mysterious lantern had opened channels for receiving guidance that continued operating beyond the specific circumstances of that stormy night. One particularly memorable consultation involved rancher whose cattle had begun exhibiting unusual behavior that conventional explanations couldn't address satisfactorily. Elena suggested exploring areas of his property that seemed to attract or repel the animals, eventually discovering abandoned well that had been contaminating local water sources through seepage that affected animal instincts while remaining undetectable through ordinary testing methods. "How did you know to look there?" the grateful rancher asked, after successful resolution of the problem had restored his cattle to normal behavior pattern. Eleanor considered various responses before settling on honest acknowledgement of her limitations. Sometimes solutions present themselves through attention to details that seem unimportant until they reveal patterns suggesting where investigation might prove productive. I've learned to trust such impressions, even when I can't explain their origin. This approach, combining practical observation with receptivity to intuitive guidance, became characteristic of Elena's developing reputation as someone who could solve problems that defeated more conventional approaches. Her father's journal provided ongoing source of wisdom that helped her understand the philosophical foundations underlying such methodology, while her own expanding experience demonstrated its effectiveness across increasingly diverse challenges. As her second year managing the ranch independently progressed towards successful completion, Elena reflected on the transformation that had begun with following mysterious light through storm-deafened Arroyo. What had initially seemed like isolated incident now appeared as catalyst for comprehensive development of abilities and perspectives that were reshaping not only her own life, but her relationships with neighbors and her role within the broader community. The desert that had once seemed merely beautiful but potentially hostile now revealed itself as source of ongoing guidance for those who learned to perceive its subtle communications. Every sunset brought new appreciation for the interplay between light and landscape that created beauty while teaching lessons about patience, timing, and recognition of opportunities that appeared briefly before disappearing into different configuration. Eleanor's cattle thrived under management that balanced practical attention to their physical needs with awareness of environmental factors that influenced their behavior in ways that conventional ranching wisdom often overlooked. Her small garden produced abundance that exceeded what soil conditions should have supported, suggesting that plants responded positively to care that incorporated understanding of relationships between weather patterns, moon phases, and seasonal cycles that extended beyond obvious surface considerations. Most importantly, Elena had developed confidence that challenges which might arise in future would be met with adequate resources, whether through her own growing capabilities or through assistance that might arrive through channels she was learning to recognize and trust. The mysterious lantern had provided more than shelter from one storm. It had illuminated pathways towards sustainable relationship with landscape and community that honored both practical necessities and deeper sources of wisdom, that connected human activity to larger patterns of natural harmony. Standing on her porch as another desert evening painted familiar landscape with colors that never ceased to inspire wonder, Elena opened her father's journal to record thoughts about her continuing education in desert wisdom. The lantern in the arroyo taught me that guidance comes to those who need it most, when they demonstrate readiness to follow light into unknown territory with trust rather than fear, she wrote. Each day since has provided additional confirmation that such trust opens possibilities for relationship with this land and this life that conventional approaches alone could never achieve. The stars emerged with their nightly brilliance, each point of light a reminder that illumination comes in countless forms to those who learn to perceive it. Eleanor closed the journal with gratitude for mysteries that continued revealing themselves through patient attention and willing heart, knowing that tomorrow would bring new opportunities to practice lessons learned from following unexpected guidance through stormy nights towards shelter, safety, and ever-expanding understanding of the remarkable world that surrounded her chosen home. As Eleanor's reputation for understanding the desert's subtle wisdom spread throughout the territory, travelers began seeking her counsel before embarking on journeys through the more remote regions. Her encounters with mysterious guidance had marked her as someone who could perceive dimensions of the landscape that escaped ordinary observation, making her advice valuable to those venturing into areas where conventional navigation might prove insufficient. One autumn evening, as golden light painted the high desert in shades of amber and crimson, a weathered prospector named Thomas McKenna arrived at Elena's ranch, seeking directions to a location he described only as the place where stories grow on trees. His manner suggested a man accustomed to solitude and mystery, yet respectful of wisdom that came through unconventional channels. "Heard tell you might know something about the old places," McKenna said, accepting offered coffee while studying Eleanor with eyes that had seen much of the frontier's hidden aspects. Places where the land itself holds memories, and those memories sometimes share themselves with folks who know how to listen. Elena recognized in his words the same respectful approach to mystery that had guided her own encounters with phenomena beyond ordinary explanation. She had heard whispered references to such a place, stories passed down through generations of desert dwellers, about an ancient tree that somehow preserved and shared the tales of all who had rested in its shade. "Whispering Rock," she said quietly, watching McKenna's face for confirmation. "Though I've never seen it myself, only heard stories from those who claim their grandfathers once knew the way." McKenna nodded slowly, his expression mixing relief at finding someone who acknowledged the location's existence with concern about the challenges involved in reaching it. "The stories say the tree chooses who finds it and when, but they also say that sometimes, when the need is great enough, it can be found by those who follow the right guidance." As twilight deepened around them, Elena found herself sharing what she knew of the mysterious tree's legend, while sensing that her own journey toward understanding the desert's deeper mysteries was preparing to enter a new chapter. The lantern in the arroyo had taught her to trust guidance that came through unexpected means. Perhaps now she was being called toward an encounter with wisdom that grew from even more ancient roots. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the high country as Samuel Reeves guided his weathered bay gelding along the narrow trail that wound its way toward Whispering Rock. At 43, Samuel carried the lean, hardened look of a man who had spent the better part of 2 decades drifting from town to town, ranch to ranch, never staying long enough for roots to take hold. His saddlebags contained everything he owned: spare clothes, basic provisions, a few dog-eared books, and memories he preferred to keep buried beneath layers of dust and distance. The trail climbed steadily through stands of pine and aspen, their leaves already touched with the gold and crimson of early autumn. Samuel had heard about Whispering Rock from a bartender in Valentine, who mentioned it as a good place to camp for the night if a man was traveling north toward the Grizzlies. "Look for the old juniper," the man had said, wiping down glasses with practiced efficiency. "Biggest tree you'll see up there, growing right out of the rock face." Travelers been using that spot for generations. What the bartender hadn't mentioned, what Samuel would only discover upon arriving, was the tree's reputation among locals as something far more significant than a mere landmark. The Story Tree, they called it, though he wouldn't learn that name until later, when twilight had settled and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky above the high country. As his horse picked its way carefully up the rocky incline, Samuel found his thoughts drifting, as they often did during long rides, to the question that had haunted him for years. What did a man do when he'd spent so long running from his past that he'd forgotten what he was running toward? The question held particular weight today as he was riding away from yet another job that had ended badly, not through any fault of his own, but through the simple inability to form the kinds of connections that made staying worthwhile. The trail crested a small ridge, and suddenly, Whispering Rock revealed itself in all its weathered majesty. The formation rose nearly 100 feet from the surrounding landscape, its red sandstone face carved by countless years of wind and weather into smooth flowing curves that caught and held the afternoon light. But it was the tree that immediately commanded attention. An ancient juniper growing impossibly from a crack in the rock face, its massive trunk twisted and gnarled by decades of mountain weather, its branches reaching out like welcoming arms over a natural terrace that provided perfect shelter for travelers. Samuel reined in his horse, studying the scene with the practiced eye of a man accustomed to evaluating campsites. The terrace offered level ground, protection from wind, and a commanding view of the surrounding country. A small spring emerged from the rock face nearby, providing fresh water, while scattered fire rings indicated this spot had indeed been used by travelers for many years. Most importantly, the location felt peaceful, a quality that had become increasingly important to Samuel as restless years accumulated behind him. Dismounting with the fluid grace of a lifelong horseman, Samuel began the familiar routine of making camp. He unsaddled his horse and hobbled the animal where good grass grew in patches between the rocks, then gathered deadfall from nearby trees for an evening fire. As he worked, he found himself glancing frequently at the great juniper, struck by its ancient presence and the way late sunlight filtered through its dense foliage to create shifting patterns of light and shadow on the stone terrace below. Only when he had a small fire crackling and coffee beginning to bubble in his battered pot did Samuel finally allow himself to truly relax. Settling back against his saddle, he gazed out over the vast landscape that stretched away from Whispering Rock in all directions. Rolling hills clothed in forest, distant peaks touched with snow, and somewhere far below, the silver thread of a river winding through green meadows toward destinations unknown. The peace of the place settled around him like a comfortable blanket, and for the first time in weeks, Samuel felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. This was what he had been seeking without realizing it. Not just a place to spend the night, but a refuge from the constant motion that had defined his life for so long. Here, beneath the spreading branches of the ancient juniper, time seemed to slow, allowing space for thoughts and feelings he typically kept buried beneath the demands of survival and forward movement. As evening deepened and the first stars appeared overhead, Samuel became aware of a subtle sound that hadn't been present during the bustle of making camp. At first, he dismissed it as wind moving through the juniper's branches, but as he listened more carefully, the sound took on a different quality, almost like whispered voices carrying on the night breeze, too soft to make out individual words, but unmistakably human in their cadence and rhythm. Samuel sat up straighter, studying the darkness beyond his fire's circle of light. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, as if the very air around Whispering Rock held traces of countless conversations that had taken place beneath the juniper's sheltering branches. Though he had always considered himself a practical man with little patience for superstition, something about the whispered voices felt natural rather than supernatural, as if the tree and stone had somehow absorbed the echoes of human presence and now released them back into the night like a gentle exhalation. "Evening, stranger." The voice, clear and definitely real, caused Samuel to reach instinctively for the rifle beside his bedroll before his eyes located its source. An elderly man emerged from the shadows at the edge of the firelight, leading a sturdy mule packed with what appeared to be camping gear and traveling supplies. Despite his age, Samuel guessed him to be past 70, the man moved with the steady confidence of someone completely comfortable in wild places. "Didn't mean to startle you," the elderly man continued, raising one hand in peaceful greeting. "Name's Thomas Whitehorse. I camp here every autumn, same time each year. Hope you don't mind sharing the hospitality of the old tree." Samuel relaxed, lowering his hand from the rifle. "Samuel Reeves. And I don't mind at all. Seems like there's room enough for both of us under these branches." Thomas nodded approval as he began unpacking his mule with movements that spoke of long practice. "You chose well for your first night here," he observed, glancing meaningfully at Samuel's simple but well-organized camp. "Most folks who find this place by accident don't understand what makes it special until they've spent some time listening." "Listening?" Samuel asked, curious about the odd phrasing. Thomas smiled, an expression that transformed his weathered features. "To the stories, of course. That's what the tree remembers. Every tale that's been told beneath its branches over the years. Some say if you listen carefully on quiet nights, you can hear them whispered back on the wind." Samuel considered this, thinking of the soft voices he'd noticed earlier. "And you believe that?" "I've been coming here for 15 years, Thomas replied, kindling his own small fire a respectful distance from Samuel's. "Every autumn, I add new stories to what the tree remembers, and every year I hear things in the wind that remind me of tales I'd nearly forgotten. Some I told myself, others I heard from travelers who shared this spot in seasons past. As if summoned by their conversation about stories, the sound of approaching voices drifted up from the trail below." Thomas tilted his head, listening with obvious pleasure. Ah, young Clara and her grandfather, right on schedule. Within minutes, two figures emerged into the firelight, an elderly Apache man leading a Payne pony, and a girl of perhaps 10 walking beside him, her eyes bright with curiosity as she took in the camp beneath the great juniper. The man raised his hand in greeting, speaking first to Thomas in what Samuel recognized as Apache before switching to English. "Thomas, old friend, good to see you made it up here safely again this year." "Wouldn't miss it, Joseph," Thomas replied warmly. "And how is young Clara, still collecting stories faster than you can tell them?" The girl, Clara, grinned at this characterization. "Grandfather says every place has stories hiding in it, waiting for the right person to listen. This tree must have more stories than anywhere else in the territory." Joseph nodded gravely. "The juniper has stood here longer than any of us can remember. My grandfather's grandfather spoke of camping beneath its branches as a young man. All those years, all those travelers sharing their tales. Yes, I think it remembers. Samuel found himself drawn into conversation with these unexpected companions as they settled around the communal warmth of the fires. Joseph, he learned, was taking Clara on what he called a story-walking journey, visiting places throughout the region where significant events had occurred or where oral traditions located important tales. The old ways of remembering are fading, Joseph explained, as Clara helped him prepare their simple evening meal. Television, radio, books, all wonderful things, but they change how stories live in people's minds. I want Clara to understand how stories used to be kept alive, passed from person to person like precious gifts. And the tree helps with that? Samuel asked, genuinely intrigued by this perspective. The tree listens, Clara answered before her grandfather could respond. Grandfather says when you tell a story to someone who really listens, part of that story stays with them forever. The tree has been listening to travelers' stories for so long that it must be full of them by now. Thomas chuckled appreciatively. Clara understands it better than most adults. The tree doesn't just remember the words, it remembers the feelings behind them, the reasons people needed to tell their stories in the first place. As full darkness settled over Whispering Rock, and the stars emerged in brilliant profusion overhead, the four travelers found themselves drawn together in the intimate circle created by firelight and the juniper's sheltering presence. Without any formal arrangement, storytelling began. First Thomas sharing a humorous tale about a confused bear he'd encountered on his journey north, then Joseph offering a traditional story about how Coyote had stolen fire for the people. Clara contributed a story her school teacher had told about the building of the railroad, while even Samuel found himself recounting an incident from his early days working cattle drives in Texas. Each story seemed to add something to the atmosphere beneath the tree, as if the ancient juniper was indeed listening and somehow incorporating these new tales into its vast collection of human experience. As the evening progressed, Samuel became increasingly aware of the whispered sounds he'd noticed earlier. During pauses in conversation, when the fire crackled quietly and the wind moved gently through the juniper's branches, he could swear he heard fragments of other voices, other stories that had been shared beneath this same tree in seasons past. The phenomenon didn't frighten him, rather, it created a sense of connection to something larger than his own solitary existence. "Do you hear them too?" Clara asked quietly, having noticed Samuel's attentive listening during one of these whispered interludes. Samuel nodded, no longer feeling foolish about acknowledging the mysterious voices. Like conversations from long ago, still floating in the air. Grandfather says the land remembers everything that happens on it, the girl continued, her young voice carrying surprising wisdom. Happy things, sad things, important things that people needed to share with someone who would listen. The tree has been listening longer than any person, so it remembers the most. Joseph smiled at his granddaughter's explanation. She has the gift of understanding such things. Many people walk through the world without really listening, to the land, to each other, to the stories that need telling. But Clara hears what others miss. Thomas poked at his fire, sending sparks spiraling up toward the star-filled sky. That's why I come here every year, he said thoughtfully. Not just to add new stories, but to remember old ones. Sometimes a man gets so caught up in moving forward that he forgets the value of looking back, understanding how the stories of his past connect to create the person he's become. These words struck Samuel with unexpected force. resonating with questions he'd been avoiding for years. How long had it been since he'd really examined the stories of his own life? Not just the events themselves, but their meaning, their connection to who he was and who he might yet become. His instinctive response was the familiar urge to deflect, to keep conversation focused on others rather than turning inward, toward territories he preferred to avoid. But something about the setting, the ancient tree, the gentle company, the whispered voices of countless previous travelers, made deflection feel not just inappropriate, but impossible. For the first time in years, Samuel found himself genuinely considering the stories he had never told, the experiences he had never shared, the connections he had avoided making out of fear that staying still long enough to form them would somehow trap him in situations he couldn't control. "What about you, Samuel?" Thomas asked gently, as if sensing the direction of his thoughts. "What stories brought you to the tree tonight?" The question hung in the air between them, neither demanding nor dismissive, simply offering space for whatever response felt appropriate. Samuel stared into the fire, watching flames dance among the carefully arranged logs, and found himself thinking not about the dramatic events that might make for entertaining storytelling, but about quieter moments that had shaped him more profoundly than any adventure. "I suppose I've spent so many years collecting other people's stories that I've forgotten how to tell my own," he said finally, surprised by his own honesty. Clara looked at him with the directness that only children possess. "What kind of stories did you collect?" Samuel considered the question, realizing that in many ways this simple inquiry cut to the heart of how he'd lived his adult life. Stories about places, mostly. People would tell me about their towns, their families, their work, and I'd listen, remember what I could, then move on. Always moving on. "But never sharing your own stories with them?" Joseph asked, his tone carrying no judgment, only curiosity. "Sharing stories means staying in one place long enough for people to know you," Samuel replied, understanding something about himself as he spoke the words. "And staying means commitments, expectations, people counting on you to be there tomorrow and the day after that." Thomas nodded, understanding. "And you weren't ready for that kind of staying?" "Weren't ready or were afraid of it?" Clara asked, with the devastating honesty that children can deploy without realizing its impact. Samuel met her eyes across the fire, seeing no challenge there, only genuine curiosity about a question that had apparently occurred to her as naturally as wondering about the weather. "Both, I think," he admitted. "Afraid that if people really knew my stories, they'd expect me to stay and keep adding new chapters with them. Afraid that if I stopped moving, I'd have to face the reasons I started running in the first place." The admission hung in the air like smoke from the fire, visible and real but somehow weightless. Around them, the whispered voices in the wind seemed to grow slightly more distinct, as if Samuel's honesty had somehow tuned him more precisely to the frequency on which the tree's memories operated. "The tree doesn't expect anything from the stories it hears," Thomas observed quietly. "It just listens, remembers, and lets them become part of something larger. Maybe that's what real listening is. Receiving stories without trying to change them or use them for your own purposes." "Grandfather says stories want to be shared," Clara added, settling more comfortably against her pack. "They get lonely living inside just one person. That's why people tell them, not because they have to, but because the stories need to find more places to live." Samuel found himself considering this perspective, the idea that his carefully guarded experiences might actually want to be shared, that the isolation he'd maintained might be as much a burden to his untold stories as it was to himself. Around him, the night seemed to pulse with gentle encouragement, the whispered voices carrying what felt like approval rather than judgment. "I had a brother once," Samuel said suddenly, the words emerging before he'd consciously decided to speak them. Younger than me by 3 years. His name was David, and he could make anyone laugh, even during the worst times. Thomas settled back against his saddle, recognizing the beginning of a story that had been long held inside. Joseph and Clara also grew still, sensing the significance of what Samuel was choosing to share. We worked together on our father's ranch in Colorado, Samuel continued, his voice growing steadier as he found the rhythm of the telling. David was the one who really understood cattle, who could read the weather, who knew exactly what needed doing without anyone having to explain it to him. I was older, so I thought I was the one who should inherit the place, but anyone with sense could see that David was the real rancher in the family. The fire crackled quietly as Samuel paused, gathering courage for the more difficult parts of the story. Above them, the juniper's branches stirred in a barely perceptible breeze, and the whispered voices seemed to grow more supportive, as if countless previous storytellers were offering encouragement from wherever such voices originate. Paul Winter. This would have been 18 years ago now. We lost most of our herd to a combination of disease and weather. Father had borrowed money against the ranch to buy new stock, and suddenly we were facing bankruptcy. David had ideas about how to rebuild, plans that made sense, but they would have taken time to implement. Samuel found himself looking directly at Clara as he continued, drawn by her obvious attention and complete lack of judgment about whatever was coming next in his tale. I convinced Father to sell the ranch instead, argued that it was the practical choice, the safe choice, that we could start over somewhere else without the burden of debt. I made it sound like wisdom, but really I was scared. Scared of the responsibility, scared of failing, scared of being trapped in one place for the rest of my life. "What happened to David?" Clara asked gently when Samuel fell silent. David used his share to selling, but I was the older brother and I was persistent. The ranch sold, Father paid off his debts, and we all went our separate ways with what money was left. David used his share to buy into a smaller operation down in New Mexico, and I started drifting. Told myself I was seeing the country, learning different ways of doing things, but really I was just running from what I'd done. Thomas stirred the fire with a long stick, sending fresh sparks up toward the stars. "Did you ever see him again?" Samuel shook his head. "I wrote letters for the first few years, but David's responses got shorter and less frequent. Eventually, they stopped coming altogether. I heard through mutual friends that his ranch failed during the drought of '86, and that he'd moved further south, but I never tried to find him. Told myself he was better off without reminders of what we'd lost." "And you've been running ever since?" Joseph observed, his tone carrying understanding rather than criticism. 18 years of moving from job to job, place to place, never staying long enough to make the kinds of connections that require real commitment, never letting anyone get close enough to expect me to choose their well-being over my own convenience. The confession settled around the fire like a physical presence, acknowledged by the gentle sounds of wind in the juniper's branches and the soft voices that seemed to carry Samuel's story up into the night sky, where it could join the vast collection of human experiences that the tree had witnessed over its long lifetime. "That's a hard story to carry alone," Thomas said quietly. "No wonder you've been moving so much, trying to stay ahead of it." Clara looked at Samuel with eyes that seemed far older than her years. "But you just shared it with us, and with the tree, so it's not alone anymore." Ah. The simple observation struck Samuel with unexpected force. For 18 years he had carried the guilt and regret of his decision as a private burden, convinced that sharing it would only diminish him in others' eyes. But here, beneath the ancient juniper, with 3 people who had welcomed him as a fellow traveler rather than judging him as a stranger. The story had transformed from a source of shame into something that connected him to the broader human experience of making difficult choices and living with their consequences. The tree has heard many such stories, Joseph said thoughtfully. People carrying burdens they thought were too heavy to share, discovering that speaking them aloud somehow makes them lighter. Grandfather says that's how healing happens, Clara added, not by forgetting the sad parts, but by letting them become part of a bigger story that includes other people who understand. Samuel found himself studying the massive juniper that sheltered them, its ancient trunk twisted by decades of weather into patterns that spoke of endurance rather than defeat. How many other travelers had sat beneath these branches and shared stories they had never told anyone else? How many had discovered, as he was discovering now, that the act of honest telling somehow transformed even painful experiences into sources of connection rather than isolation? I keep thinking about David, Samuel admitted, wondering what kind of man he became, whether he found happiness despite losing the ranch, whether he ever thinks about what might have been different if I'd been willing to stay and fight for the place instead of running away. Those are questions you might still be able to answer, Thomas suggested gently, if you wanted to. The possibility hung in the air between them, both tantalizing and terrifying. After 18 years of avoiding contact, what would he even say to David? How could he explain a lifetime of running without admitting that he'd been too much of a coward to face the consequences of his own choices? What if he doesn't want to see me? Samuel asked, voicing the fear that had kept him moving for nearly 2 decades. What if he's built a good life and doesn't want reminders of what we lost? What if he has his own stories he's been carrying alone? Clara countered with the devastating logic that children sometimes possess. What if he's been wondering about you too, but didn't know how to reach out? The questions settled around Samuel like seeds planted in fertile ground, taking root in places within him that had been carefully guarded for years. Around their small gathering, the night seemed to pulse with gentle encouragement, the whispered voices in the wind carrying what felt like approval for the possibility of reconnection and healing. The tree doesn't just remember the stories people tell beneath its branches, Joseph observed quietly. It also witnesses the choices they make after the telling, whether they choose to carry their stories forward into new chapters, or whether they continue carrying them as burdens that prevent new growth. Samuel understood that he was being offered something precious here, not just the opportunity to share his long-held story, but the possibility of transforming that story from an ending into a beginning. The realization was both liberating and overwhelming, opening up futures he had trained himself not to imagine. I wouldn't even know where to start looking for him, Samuel said, though even as he spoke the words he was remembering details from David's last letters. The names of towns, mutual acquaintances, people who might still know his whereabouts. Every long journey starts with deciding to take the first step, Thomas replied. The rest reveals itself as you go. Around them the fire had burned down to glowing coals that cast dancing shadows on the rock face behind the great juniper. The whispered voices had grown quieter but somehow more distinct, as if Samuel's willingness to share his own story had tuned him more precisely to the frequency on which the tree's vast collection of memories operated. Clara yawned, the lateness of the hour finally catching up with her youthful energy. "Will you look for your brother?" she asked Samuel, as Joseph began arranging her bedroll. Samuel considered the question, not just the words themselves, but the deeper inquiry they represented about what kind of man he chose to be going forward. "I think I might," he said finally. surprised by how natural the possibility felt once he'd spoken it aloud. "The tree will remember this story too now," Clara said sleepily as she settled into her blankets. "So even if you decide to keep traveling, part of tonight will always be here, waiting for other people who need to hear it." As the child drifted off to sleep with the easy exhaustion of youth, the three men maintained quiet conversation around the dying fire. Thomas shared stories of other travelers he'd encountered at this same spot over his 15 years of annual visits. People carrying various burdens who had found healing through the simple act of honest telling. Beneath the juniper's patient branches, there was a woman a few years back, he recounted quietly, who had lost her husband and child in a fever epidemic. She'd been wandering from town to town, unable to settle anywhere because every place reminded her of what she'd lost. Spent the night here and told the tree about her family, really told it, with all the love and grief she'd been holding inside. "What happened to her?" Samuel asked. "She stopped running," Thomas replied simply. "Went back to her hometown and opened a school for children whose parents had died in the same epidemic. Last I heard, she'd become one of those people the whole community depends on. Not because she forgot her loss, but because she found a way to let it connect her to others who needed what she could offer." Joseph nodded, understanding. Grief can isolate or connect, depending on whether we hold it close or let it flow through us toward others who understand. Same with regret, shame, fear, any of the heavy emotions we carry. Samuel absorbed this wisdom, feeling pieces of understanding click into place within him. For 18 years, he had used his regret about David as a reason to avoid deep connections with anyone else. But what if that same regret could become a source of empathy for others carrying similar burdens? What if his experience of loss could help him recognize and support people facing difficult choices about loyalty, commitment, and courage? "The tree teaches patience," Thomas observed, gazing up at the ancient juniper's massive form, silhouetted against the star-filled sky. "It's been growing here for longer than any of us can imagine, weathering storms, surviving droughts, adapting to changes in the landscape around it. But it never stopped reaching toward the light, never stopped growing new branches, never stopped listening to new stories," Samuel added, beginning to understand the deeper symbolism of this place and why it called to people carrying heavy burdens. As the night deepened and the coals of their fire settled into glowing ash, the three men gradually prepared for sleep. But Samuel found himself reluctant to surrender consciousness, afraid that the sense of possibility and connection he'd discovered beneath the juniper might fade with daylight like an unusually vivid dream. "The tree will still be here in the morning," Joseph assured him, correctly interpreting his reluctance to end the evening. "And so will the story you shared tonight. Both will be part of you whether you stay or go." Samuel nodded, understanding that the old Apache man was offering him permission to trust that the healing he'd experienced wouldn't disappear with sleep. Settling into his bedroll, he found himself listening once more to the whispered voices that moved through the juniper's branches, no longer mysterious or unsettling, but comforting in their reminder that countless other travelers had found refuge and renewal beneath these same protective limbs. As sleep finally claimed him, Samuel's last conscious thought was a clear image of David as he'd last seen him. Not the disappointed young man watching their family ranch being sold, but the earlier David who had approached every challenge with humor and determination. For the first time in 18 years, Samuel fell asleep thinking not about what he'd lost, but about what might still be possible. Morning arrived with the gentle brilliance characteristic of high country autumn. golden sunlight filtering through the juniper's dense foliage to create shifting patterns of light and shadow on the stone terrace where the four travelers had shared their evening of storytelling. Samuel woke with unusual clarity, immediately recalling not just the events of the previous night, but the sense of possibility that had emerged from his willingness to share long-held stories with understanding listeners. Around him, his companions were already stirring, moving through morning routines with practiced efficiency. Clara emerged from her blankets bright-eyed and chattering softly with her grandfather about the day's planned travel, while Thomas kindled a small fire for morning coffee with movements that spoke of decades spent in wild places. "Sleep well?" Thomas asked as Samuel sat up, automatically reaching for his boots. "Better than I have in years," Samuel replied, surprised by the truth of this statement. "Something about this place. The tree keeps good watch," Joseph observed, beginning to pack his gear with careful attention to proper balance and weight distribution. Many travelers comment on sleeping peacefully here, even those who usually struggle with rest. As Samuel prepared his own simple breakfast and tended to his horse, he found his thoughts returning repeatedly to the previous night's conversation about David. In daylight, the possibility of reconnecting with his brother felt both more real and more daunting than it had seemed around the fire. What would he actually say after 18 years of absence? How could he explain a lifetime of running without sounding like he was making excuses for choices that had hurt them both? Big decisions don't have to be made all at once, Thomas observed, apparently reading something in Samuel's expression. Sometimes the best approach is taking small steps in the right direction and seeing what opens up. Clara looked up from helping her grandfather secure their packs. "Like following a trail you can't see very far ahead on. You just keep walking toward where you think it goes." Samuel smiled at the child's matter-of-fact wisdom. "And what if the trail leads somewhere I'm not ready to go?" "Then you'll be stronger from the walking," she replied with the confidence of someone who had never doubted her ability to handle whatever lay ahead. As they prepared to leave Whispering Rock, Samuel found himself reluctant to depart from a place that had offered such unexpected healing. The great juniper seemed to pulse with quiet energy in the morning light, its ancient presence both welcoming and eternal. A reminder that some things endured while others passed through like travelers on a long journey. "Will you come back?" Clara asked as she helped her grandfather lead their pony down toward the main trail. Samuel considered the question, understanding that it carried implications beyond simple logistics. "I think I might," he said finally. "Whether I find David or not, whether I stay in one place or keep traveling, I think I'll want to come back and tell the tree how the story continues." Thomas nodded approval as he prepared to lead his mule in the opposite direction from Joseph and Clara's route. That's how the tree grows its collection. People returning to share new chapters of stories they first told beneath its branches. Some come back many times over the years, adding layers to tales that become richer and more complex with each telling. "Like watching someone's whole life unfold," Clara suggested, the idea clearly appealing to her storyteller's imagination. "Exactly like that," Thomas confirmed. "The tree witnesses not just individual stories, but the ways those stories change and develop as people make new choices based on what they've learned." As the small group prepared for their various departures, Samuel realized that he was experiencing something he hadn't felt in 18 years. Genuine anticipation about his future, rather than mere restless compulsion to keep moving. Whether or not he found David, whether or not he managed to make peace with his past, something fundamental had shifted within him during his night beneath the story tree. "Thank you," he said to the group generally. though his words were directed as much toward the ancient juniper as toward his human companions. For listening, for sharing your own stories, for helping me remember that some things are worth the risk of staying still long enough to pursue them. Joseph shook his hand with the firm grip of someone who understood the significance of the commitment Samuel was making. "The tree will remember you," he said simply, "and we will too." Clara hugged Samuel impulsively, her young face bright with the satisfaction of someone who had played a role in an important story. "I hope you find your brother," she said earnestly, "and I hope he's been looking for you too." Thomas clapped Samuel on the shoulder with weathered hand that conveyed decades of friendship offered and received in wild places. "Safe travels, whether they lead you toward the past or into new territory entirely. The tree will be here whenever you're ready to share the next chapter." As his three companions departed in their respective directions, Samuel remained beneath the juniper for several additional minutes, absorbing the morning peace and fixing details of the place firmly in his memory. The whispered voices that had seemed so mysterious the night before now felt like gentle encouragement, reminders of all the other people who had found healing and direction beneath these protective branches. Finally, Samuel saddled his horse and prepared for his own departure, though he moved with less haste than had characterized his travels for many years. The compulsive urgency that had driven him from place to place seemed to have quieted, replaced by something more deliberate and purposeful. As he guided his gelding down the trail that led away from Whispering Rock, Samuel turned once in his saddle to look back at the great juniper standing sentinel against the morning sky. For just a moment, he could swear he heard his own voice among the whispered chorus that moved through its branches. Not the fearful, guilt-ridden voice that had dominated his internal dialogue for 18 years, but something clearer and more hopeful, carrying the story he had shared and the possibilities it had opened. The tree would remember, as it remembered all the stories told beneath its ancient branches, and perhaps, Samuel thought as he rode toward whatever came next, that was enough to transform even the most carefully guarded regrets into sources of connection rather than isolation. Perhaps every story, no matter how painful its origins, carried within it the seeds of healing for both the teller and those who heard it with open hearts. Behind him, Whispering Rock stood patient and eternal, the story tree spreading its weathered arms in welcome for whatever travelers might need its shelter and witness in seasons yet to come. And ahead, the trail wound through morning light toward destinations that no longer felt like escapes, but like chapters waiting to be written in a story that finally had room to grow beyond the limitations of fear and solitude. The descent from Whispering Rock took Samuel through country he had traveled before, but never truly seen. Rolling hills clothed in autumn aspens that shimmered like scattered gold coins in the morning breeze. Meadows where late wild flowers painted purple and yellow against the rich grass. Streams that spoke in voices as varied as the travelers who had shared stories beneath the juniper. For the first time in years, Samuel found himself riding slowly, not from fatigue or indecision, but from genuine appreciation for the landscape unfolding around him. His gelding seemed to sense the change in his master's demeanor, stepping with less urgency than had characterized their travels together. The horse, a steady companion for nearly 3 years, had grown accustomed to Samuel's restless energy, the constant pressure to cover ground and reach the next destination. Now, with that pressure mysteriously absent, the animal settled into an easy walking pace that allowed both rider and mount to notice details previously lost in the rush towards somewhere else. A creek crossing where crystal water tumbled over smooth stones, Samuel dismounted to water his horse and found himself sitting on a fallen log, simply watching the play of light on moving water. When had he last allowed himself such luxury? When had he last experienced a moment without the nagging urgency to be somewhere other than where he was? The questions arose without the self-recrimination that had once accompanied such reflections. Instead, they carried gentle curiosity about what other experiences his constant motion might have cost him over the years. A movement in the nearby willows caught his attention. A young doe picking her way delicately to the water's edge, ears alert but unafraid. She drank deeply while keeping watchful eyes on Samuel and his horse, then lifted her head to study them with frank curiosity before bounding gracefully away through the golden aspens. The encounter lasted perhaps 30 seconds, but Samuel found himself smiling at the simple perfection of it. The kind of moment that required presence rather than destination to fully appreciate. By mid-afternoon, Samuel had reached the crossroads, where the trail from Whispering Rock intersected with the main route between Valentine and Strawberry. Here, he faced the first concrete decision point since leaving the Story Tree. Continue north toward familiar territory where he had worked before, or turn south toward the unknown, following an impulse that might lead toward David, or might simply represent another form of wandering. He sat in his saddle at the intersection for several minutes, feeling no pressure to choose quickly, but wanting to understand which direction felt more aligned with the person he was becoming rather than the person he had been. North lay safety, known employers, familiar routines, the comfortable anonymity of seasonal work, followed by movement to the next opportunity. South represented the unknown, including the possibility of disappointment, rejection, or the discovery that some mistakes could not be undone through good intentions alone. What would David do? Samuel asked aloud, surprised by his own voice breaking the afternoon quiet. The question seemed to answer itself as soon as he'd spoken it. David had always been the brother who faced difficulties directly, who solved problems rather than avoiding them, who built relationships instead of maintaining careful distance from potential complications. David would have started looking for his lost brother years ago, would have written letters to mutual acquaintances, would have made inquiries in towns where Samuel might have worked. The realization struck Samuel with unexpected force. He might not be the only one who had regrets about their long separation. What if David had tried to find him? What if his brother had written letters to places Samuel had already left, had made inquiries through people who didn't know where he'd gone next? The possibility that David might have been searching too transformed Samuel's planned reunion from an act of selfish seeking into something more mutual. Two brothers trying to find their way back to each other across years of silence and accumulated misunderstanding. With this perspective shift, the choice of direction became clear. Samuel turned his horse south toward New Mexico and the challenging process of following an 18-year-old trail through his brother's possible movements and current whereabouts. The journey might prove fruitless, might lead only to closed doors and strangers who had never heard David's name, but the effort itself felt important now, not just as potential healing for himself, but as tribute to a relationship that had meant more to him than he'd been willing to acknowledge during years of guilty avoidance. The southward trail led through country that grew more arid as elevation decreased, pine forests giving way to scrub oak and juniper, then to the sage and scattered cedar that characterized higher desert regions. Samuel made camp that evening beside a small spring surrounded by cottonwoods, whose leaves rustled like whispered conversations in the evening breeze. As he kindled his fire and prepared simple dinner, he found himself thinking not about David as he'd last seen him, but about shared memories from their childhood, adventures they'd undertaken together, problems they'd solved as a team, the easy camaraderie that had made them not just brothers, but genuine friends. How long had it been since he'd allowed himself to remember the good times, instead of focusing solely on how their relationship had ended? The story tree's influence seemed to extend beyond the physical act of sharing difficult truths. It had also somehow given him permission to reclaim positive memories he'd buried beneath years of guilt and regret. That night, settled in his bedroll beneath stars that seemed brighter in the thin desert air, Samuel found himself speaking aloud to the darkness. Not prayer exactly, but something like meditation on the possibilities opening before him. He told the night about David's laugh, about his brother's intuitive understanding of animals, about the way they had worked together during roundups with the wordless coordination of people who trusted each other completely. "I forgot how much I missed that," Samuel said to the stars, his voice carrying clearly in the desert quiet. "Not just David, but being part of something larger than myself. Being trusted, being counted on, being expected to show up tomorrow. And the day after that, the admission felt like continuation of the healing that had begun beneath the story tree. Acknowledgement that his years of running had cost him not just connection with David, but the entire experience of belonging somewhere, of being woven into the fabric of other people's lives and expectations. He had told himself he valued freedom above commitment, but what if what he'd really valued was the ability to disappoint people without having to face their hurt or work to repair the damage? The questions followed him into sleep, but gently, rather than with the harsh self-condemnation that had once accompanied such recognitions. Under the influence of stars and desert silence, even difficult truths felt manageable, problems to be solved rather than failures to be escaped. Samuel Reeves rode toward his uncertain future with something he hadn't carried in 18 years. Hope that the stories he had shared might lead him home, not to a place but to the connections that transform individual narratives into the larger tale of human community and understanding. The story tree had taught him that some mysteries were worth embracing, some risks worth taking, and some stories worth telling, even when their endings remained unwritten. And so, partner, as our tale rides off into the sunset, it's time for you to rest your weary bones beneath the endless prairie sky. Let the sounds of the west be your lullaby tonight, from the gentle crackle of the campfire to the soft prairie winds and the distant song of nightbirds, all flowing uninterrupted, with no advertisements to break the peace of your slumber. Sweet dreams, cowpoke, and may your trail lead to peaceful pastures tonight.